Good evening and welcome everybody to the August session of Richmond Art Gallery's Artist Salon series. My name is Kathy Tycholis. I am the Education and Public Programs Coordinator for the Richmond Art Gallery. I'll be your host for tonight, featuring our guest presenter from Mobil Art School, Jairo Salazar, on Art in Times of Crisis Part 2. So thank you to everybody who requested this, and thank you to Jairo for coming back to give us part 2. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the land that the art gallery is on their traditional and ancestral territories of the Hunkaminam speaking peoples. This is the language spoken by Musqueam and many of the nations along the Fraser River Delta. And we recognize the Indigenous peoples who have been dispossessed from their homelands and territories upon which our institution was built and currently occupies and operates in. To acknowledge this territory is to recognize the city and country's longer history that predates Confederation, one where Indigenous people have lived since time immemorial. So we are very grateful for the opportunity to create, live, and work on this land. So for those of you who are new to the program, the Artist Salon is a monthly series of artist talks that offer a mix of professional development tips and inspiration for visual artists. So the program exists as a monthly free series for you, as well as a Facebook group where we provide resources for visual artists, such as posts for artist calls, professional development opportunities, as well as a space for Lower Mainland artists to communicate and connect with one another. So to find out more about either the Facebook group, to see past sessions of the Artist Salon, please go to the Richmond Art Gallery's website. Tonight's talk comes from all the requests from last month who wanted a continuation of the talk by Jairo. So we wanted to thank you for your positive feedback, everybody out there. Hope you enjoyed tonight's session just as much as you did last time. And Jairo, thank you so much for coming back again tonight.
Thank you, Kathy.
And to know a little bit more about Jairo, he earned his MA in art history from the University of North Texas in 2008. His background includes teaching and research experience in the fields of modern and contemporary art history in the United States, Colombia, and Canada. His academic research is devoted to exploring dialogical intersections between war, catastrophe, and trauma reflected in contemporary art practices. Currently, he works as an art instructor for Coquitlam College and Mobil Art School, and he volunteers for the City of New Westminster Museum and Archives. So thank you very much, Jairo, for being here tonight. I will disappear into the background and come back when your presentation is done.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you to the Richmond Art Gallery once again for the opportunity, and the organizers of the Artist Salon series for the opportunity and the invitation to present in this series, which have been devoted to the topic of art in times of crisis. And for this second half, for those who joined for the first part of the series last month, I want to focus on depictions and artworks that incorporate the complex concept of, or the complex topic and reality of a virus, a plague, an illness, or a pandemic. So this is not necessarily a warning, but just a reminder that speaking of these topics is not easy. So there might be a chance that for some of you, there might be some concepts or some images that might be a little bit, I don't want to say controversial, but rather a little bit hard to process. So I hope that you engage in that discussion, and hopefully we will go along with it, and we will try to enjoy the conversation, enjoy not necessarily in a positive manner, but enjoy in the sense of being critical about the current times, and also being critical about our past. And if we learn from our past, maybe, just maybe, there's the chance of not repeating the same mistakes of that past over and over again. Contrary to common belief, there aren't too many depictions of plagues or pandemics through the history of art. And the reason might be simpler than what we will expect. First, in order to paint a subject, artists need a commission. In times of crisis, art commissions were rather scarce, for there will be no audience, interest, budget, or simply a strong reason to depict, show, and collect something of that nature. Second, portrayals of disease or decay were not the priority or in the taste of art patrons, merchants, or collectors. If we understand that art's function in society was to represent the power, the authority, and the rulership of the wealthy, a virus, a disease, or a plague are the entire opposite of that ideal. And when we talk about ideals, we also talk about ideals of beauty. Third, when looking at depictions of diseases in art, we can only see a symbolic before, if you allow me the term. What I mean by this is the fear to contract the illness exemplified through epic clashes of humans with gods, demons, or spirits. We can only see the eternal present, the affections of the illness in the human body, or the after, the dead body consumed by the illness. However, we cannot portray a battle of epic proportions with the virus or the plague itself. As a consequence of this, artists had the challenge of giving face to an immaterial threat to human existence. In antiquity, the general belief was that epidemic diseases were punishments sent by the gods. If we place ourselves in the Bible, we can recall how God created humans with the intentions to be immortal, pure of illness, or devoid of calamities. Of course, that was no longer the case after the original sin, when Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden fruit and were punished and expelled from the Garden of Eden. In the Old Testament, we find examples of plagues brought by God, such as in the Exodus with the 7 plagues of Egypt. Between 735 and 737, the Japanese smallpox epidemic killed around 1 million only in Japan. And here we find a depiction of that phenomenon. First of many recorded smallpox epidemics throughout Japan's history. And this also brings a second thesis. In Eastern countries, plagues were believed to be the result of demonic forces, witchery, or possessive spirits. This smallpox was believed to be brought by a merciless entity known as Oniro from the Japanese folklore. And his name also was Hososhin, which was a traditional name given to the specific entity causing smallpox. If we focus on this artwork, look at the chosen colors for the composition, but mainly look at the figure in the background. The color red was associated with the disease. So villagers used this color to persuade, but also to scare the spirit. And the spirit was responsible for bringing the smallpox, but he did not want to contract it. And we see here a red figure in the background with small red dots covering its entire body. In contrast, This early Renaissance fresco by Buffalmacco, painted roughly a decade before the Black Death, became a real threat to Europe. The picture shows the striking contrasts between the living and the dead. In the foreground, on the right, we see a group of youths full of life, enjoying the early pleasures of existence without realizing that they were being surveyed and under siege by ruthless angels of death. The youth unacknowledged the presence of death. They unacknowledged the threat represented by death. The angels are collecting corpses over the heads of the naive youngsters who are unaware of the possibility of being taken away by the arrival of death. At the left, we see 3 corpses, 3 coffins. They are dead. But also, there are, remember the title, the 3 dead and the 3 living, there are more than 3 living. We see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What does that mean? Maybe out of those 5 or 6, only 3 will survive. And look at the gesture of one of the subjects, of 2 of the subjects, actually, covering their noses in disgust to the repellent and putrid smells coming out of the rotten, infected corpses. At the center of the composition, if we go back here, we find a scroll suspended by angels over the crippled beggars in the center, and the scroll reads the following, I open quote, "Since prosperity has completely deserted us, O dead, you who are the medicine for all pain, come to give us our last supper." End of quote. So in a way, these subjects here are witnessing and pointing at their own destiny. It is very unlikely that the 6 of them will survive the plague. This Baroque depiction of the plague incorporates many of the elements characteristic of this period: chiaroscuro, dramatism, and exaggerated elongations of the human anatomy to reinforce the feeling of physical pain and agony. This is a painting on the wall of the church of San Rocco, and San Roque was a healer saint who decided to visit the Lazar house. In depictions such as this, we also find, in a typical Baroque manner, the critical significance of space to reinforce the sense of tragedy in the scene, but also to illustrate the compelling conditions in which the sick were put in quarantine to combat the disease. So it's a painting not only about illness, it's a painting not only about people, it's a painting also about a space. The artist depicts the space where Venice's plague victims sheltered during the 16th century. So in a way, it's also a hospital propaganda. The saint is portrayed performing godly miracles to the sick suffering at the Scuola Grande di San Rocco. As we could expect, the only possible interest coming from a patron into commissioning a work of art about epidemics was to convey a propagandistic message of compassion, boundless mercy, and solidarity with those in need. If we acknowledge the historical function of art in perpetuating values, reassuring morals, and establishing standards of ideal beauty, we can understand the challenging and contradictory attempt of embellishing the causes, ongoings, and consequences of a disease. Artists such as Buffalmacco, the one that we saw previously, or Peter Bruegel had that debate in mind. These depictions of the triumph of death are aesthetically pleasing. The composition is beautiful. The color choices are incredible, outstanding. Beautiful, if you allow me to coin the term. However, they are not beautiful in what they show, thematically speaking. A large army of death is taking over the town. At the left, we see the king and a bishop being mocked, being overtaken by the death. The death is consuming their lives. And at the right, we see the civilians caught while dining and others while playing board games. Death is conquering the existence of these villagers. The everyday is interrupted, as you can see here. The common interactions, the normality of life is being interrupted by the disruption, by the presence, the overwhelming presence of death. What we see here in this second part is the affected, colonized body. The body has been severely altered by the emergence of the disease. In this affected, I repeat this, colonized body. Spots, stained skin, moles, and repetitive patterns as they affect the bodies of these indigenous populations. Illnesses, we see here illnesses as a consequence of human migrations and colonialist interests. I open quote here, a 16th century ethnographic research study in Mesoamerica by the Spanish Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, currently held in Biblioteca Medicia Lawrenceana in Florence. It is valid to say that many of the most devastating recorded plagues through human history were brought as a consequence of European expansionism. The present artwork depicts in 5 panels the effects of smallpox in Aztec communities. It has been recorded that at least 56 million Native Americans have died of smallpox. And the smallpox virus was one of the main causes of the success of the Spanish conquests of the Americas throughout the 15th and 16th century. European settlers were already immune to the disease while the natives weren't. What is interesting about this depiction is the lack of color as well. So you see that the depiction is more concerned with the effects of the disease in the body rather than with the effectism and the efficiency of the Baroque style into portraying miraculous deeds or miraculous events. Speaking of immunity and colonial power, a clear illustration of dominance and almighty authority through otherness is found here in the painting of the Baron Antoine Jean Gros of Bonaparte visiting the victims of the plague at Jaffa. This is a clear illustration of dominance and almighty authority through otherness. It is as though Napoleon was saying, those who fell ill are the weak, are the others, but not me. I don't get sick. Does that ring a bell with contemporary issues? I want to share with you the Louvre's description of the painting. This painting is at the Museum of Louvre in Paris. I open quote. The painter Antoine Jean Gros depicts the courage of General Bonaparte visiting plague-striking soldiers in Jaffa, Syria in 1799. Napoleon is touching one of the plague victims as Christ did a leper. This huge canvas, hugely acclaimed at the 1804 Salon, was the first masterpiece of Napoleonic painting. Although the heroic nudes recall the work of Ross's master David, the warm colors, chiaroscuro, and oriental decor foreshadow romantic painting. End of quote. You might be thinking, wait a minute, how come that the painting was celebrated in the Salon? Turns out the painting, if you look at the year, was produced 5 years after the event. What the description of the Louvre dismisses is an obvious reality. The painting acted as a propagandistic device that reinforced racial and cultural biases towards the other. In this case, the other is the Muslim, the Arab, a tokenizing practice known as Orientalism. The scene shows Napoleon as a Christ-like figure who only by the touch of his hand can cure the lepers. In an awful twist of events, however, and considering what is depicted and narrated by the description of the museum, it has been recorded that Napoleonic troops apparently ordered to execute all those sick soldiers with the plague to avoid potential delays in the troops' journey of invading and advancing in their war objectives. The painting presented at the 1804 Salon shortly before Napoleon's coronation, a particularly opportune moment for Napoleon, was the first masterpiece of Napoleonic history painting. The conflict between theme and style, remember that debate that we were having regarding how to portray in beauty terms something that is not beautiful. That conflict between theme and style, the clash between beauty and ugliness, would be solved partially until the 20th century with the arrival of avant-garde expressionistic movements such as Fauvism, German Expressionism, or Dada. But this stylistic shift was not a deliberate result. It was rather arbitrary, or should I say circumstantial, as a consequence of two major events that changed the course of modern history. First, the Great War, World War I, and second, the so-called Spanish flu of 1918. After those two events, any rationale, any logics, any attempt to defend ideals of beauty in art were put into stake and seemed a little obsolete. Artists found artistic means to defend and unlock a transgressive idea of art in which human experiences of any kind were not subject to fabricated ideas of beauty and taste. More than a representation of a testimony or of a moment, artists decided to switch into a material presentation. In other words, an extension of their own life experiences. Norwegian painter Edvard Munch contracted the flu, but as opposed to Gustav Klimt or Egon Schiele, who died of the flu, survived. We see on the left the self-portrait while he is dealing with the flu, and at the right after he recovered. And look at the lack of facial features on the left painting, the lack of identity, the loss of the sense of being, the sense of self. The chosen pigments, textures, and material appearances of the painterly surface evoke ideas related to disease, decay, sickness, and rotting, a contrast of pale and intense yellows, greens, browns, and intense pure reds on the right side painting. Modern art, as previously discussed with artists such as Pablo Picasso, was characterized for an inclination towards inner personal expressiveness, introspection as a transgressive style, and the exploration of the self as materialized in the apparently unfinished, thick, and rough aspect of the painting. The excess of color, the loose, speedy brushstrokes, the empty areas all speak of the personality and inner feelings of the artist. So it's not that the artists didn't know how to paint. For those of you who are attending this webinar and are not very familiar with art concepts, we tend to believe, my child could paint this. No, they did know art techniques and practices and all that, traditions and styles, but they were purposefully using color to express their physical and mental state. And this is what Egon Schiele is doing here. With this unfinished painting, he couldn't finish it by the time of his death. And again, we see here the twisted bodies, elongated, unrealistic, deformed shapes that, however, transmit precisely that feeling of decay, ceasing existence, and anguish. As opposed to common thinking, this is not Egon Schiele's child, it's his nephew. But he wanted to have a kid of his own, but he couldn't. He died very young, and his wife passed away of the Spanish flu even before him. So he's portraying here an ideal family portrait, conveying unconditional, eternal love, but also resignation for the inevitability of death. You see my background? You see the painting right there. It's the same painting. Edward Hopper's Rooms by the Sea from 1951. In times of a plague or a pandemic, intimate personal space achieves a critical importance. For those are the places where diseases of any nature can be easily spread, but they can also signify an isolated, self-contained place to spend a lockdown or a quarantine. I bring this image to reflect upon our current feelings of loneliness, confinement, and isolation, but also to illustrate how the absence of people in this picture speak volumes of the most basic and conflicting human needs. Despite the absence of human bodies in this composition, the painting is as human as we can get. It transmits a sense of warmth, solitude, expectations, and reconciliation with the outside, dreams and projections of the future, a beach day, a summer day at the beach for those who are around this area in BC, in Canada, freedom, and also the feeling of enclosure. The door is open, but we cannot go anywhere. You don't want to drown yourself in the sea. Pay careful attention to the chromatic palette. Blue is freedom, yellow is interior and solitude, red and green, which by the way are complementary colors, are intimate but also contained. Keep this information in mind for future reference. In Cindy Sherman's Untitled number 179 from the Disgust Picture series, we find an ungendered, cropped body, When I say ungendered, I mean that we're not sure whether it is a man, a woman, a transvestite, a transgender body. We're not sure of the identity of the body. We are entering the scene, so Sherman is making us witness a situation that happened or is bound to happen. Identities of the body are built or destroyed through the consumption and disposal of objects, others, if you will. These objects, in a similar fashion as Hopper with the empty spaces, are indexed clues of the residues of human existence. Food, crumpled attire, condoms, and decay. I open quote here. This series, this is a description found in a website, engages with the abject, a term coined by Julia Kristeva, defined as the inability to distinguish between inside and outside, subject and object of the human body, a distinction upon which traditional conceptions of a whole, self-contained identity rest. Everything touched, affected, modified, discarded, or expelled by a human interaction, a disposable mask, a rubber glove, a tissue, toilet paper. It is the day where I still don't understand what the big buzz with the toilet paper was during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I don't understand why our immediate, perhaps unconscious reaction to the emergency and to the WHO's declaration of the virus as a pandemic was to thrive to the supermarket to hoard on toilet paper. Why do we connect disease or sickness with excrement? Abjection is, quoting Elizabeth Ross, a scholar specialized in Julia Kristeva's abjection theory. I open quote, abjection is the body's acknowledgement that the boundaries and limits imposed on it are really social projections. It testifies to the precarious grasp of the subject on its own identity, an assertion that the subject may slide back into the impure chaos out of which it was formed. It seems, however, that in times of a plague, an epidemic, or a global pandemic, our human innermost urges, physical contact, hugging, shaking hands, breathing, sneezing, coughing, sweating, touching, sexual intercourse, are paradoxically overruled, forbidden. As a matter of fact, the abject becomes political. Governments and local authorities become the owners of our body choices and biological functions. In our current times, sanitation and asepsis are the rule. Kissing Doesn't Kill, Greed and Indifference Do, was as political and collective as you can get. The act of manipulating advertisement and media strategies to reach a broad audience with information about AIDS and the issues surrounding it are a particular interest of Grand Fury, and we talked about this in the previous meeting, the previous webinar. The project consisted in two actions mainly, one being a mail postcard that people will get, particularly authorities, and the other a large public billboard emulating the postcard with the same motif of the postcard, which placed on New York City's public transit. The photograph, the image, includes three interracial couples embraced in a kiss in a gesture resembling the shape of a heart. Two of those couples are homosexual. The image is also reminiscent of trendy ads of the era used by fashion brands such as Benetton. On the right, in 25% test positive, they placed the partially covered face of a prisoner who presumably contracted AIDS, staring at the viewer who in a way feel guilty and responsible of his condition. The image attempts to raise public awareness of the matter. So the imprisoned individual is staring at us and we feel compelled, we feel accomplice of his or her own tragedy. And it reads, people with AIDS in prison live half as long as those treated outside. Let's put AIDS education and treatment behind bars. And you remember Grand Fury and Act Up because they created the famous and widespread pink triangle, which became symbol in the fight against AIDS. And the pink triangle was a direct critique towards politicians and institutions who treated the HIV virus and the resulting disease, AIDS, as an ignored condition, primarily affecting the gay community as a result of drug abuse and what they consider were sexually unacceptable practices. And this was the installation that they hosted at the museum. I believe it was in New York. I can't recall right now, where they projected the logo. Who refers to this condition as a global epidemic as opposed to a pandemic? The disease caused by the HIV virus was declared in 1981 by the WHO under the name AIDS. And Keith Haring, a street artist who will contract the disease and die of AIDS in 1990, appropriated the ACT UP Grand Fury logo in this work, portraying three yellow silhouettes devoid of any identification through gender with a red background and the message, ignorance spreads fear. And we see here primary colors also, red, blue, and yellow, very simple, very straight, sort of like borrowing ideas from mass media advertisement. General Idea was a Canadian collective based in Toronto. And something we evidence in these last artworks is a clear attempt in sabotaging the emerging obsession of governments in the Reagan-Thatcher era in the 80s in spreading a pristine culture of sanitation to combat the free, revolutionary, and anarchic punk spirit of the preceding era. Art movements, critics, and institutions were not far off to that mindset. General Idea pretended to fill the space of public places and art institutions with a body of work that opposed that ideal of the white cube. If a white cube denotes purity, a human condition, or rather a human crisis such as AIDS, incarnates the whole opposite. The AIDS logo arranges the letter AIDS into two rows within a perfect square in an intended pawn to the even clarity and purity of minimalism and abstractionist movements. Back then, you gotta consider that the word AIDS was a cultural taboo in the same fashion as in the 60s, as far as I'm concerned, cancer was a taboo word. AIDS was a word you will not hear pronouncing very often until in 1987, if I'm not wrong, Ronald Reagan was finally accepting the existence of the illness, of the condition, and coined the term in a public speech. General Idea stated, I open quote here, "We want to make the word AIDS normal." AIDS is sort of playing the part that cancer did in the 60s. By keeping the word visible, it has a normalizing effect that will hopefully play a part in normalizing people's relationship to the disease, to make it something that can be dealt with, as a disease rather than as a set of moral or ethical issues. And in this other example, oh, and of course, the logo is a direct reference. It's an appropriation of Warwick, Indiana's famous love logo in New York City, 2 blocks away from the Modern Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the MoMA. This is an artwork that I really, really enjoy because it merges art and science. The title is 1 Day of AZT and 1 Year of AZT. AZT, azodotimidine, I apologize for the pronunciation, was an antiviral compound approved by the FDA in 1987 to treat AIDS. The installation displays the daily and yearly dose of AZT. The collective blew up the actual scale of the pill to make it human size. 2 implied suggestions. There's 2 ideas come out of this. First, the implication that the AZT treatment reduces human lives into quote unquote walking pills. You know, life's dependency on a pharmaceutical pretty much. And second, the clear pun, again, towards art galleries and institutions defending the principles of the white cube and the minimalistic sterilized space. So they organized the arrow of, in this case, human scale pills, and in the walls, the arrow of blown up pills. They organized that to convey a sense of order in a chaotic reality, such as the reality of AIDS, the reality of an epidemic of that magnitude. The Spanish flu, I don't like that name, was a nationalized disease. But the connection with Spain was not racially biased. It was more of a coincidence, or rather an acknowledgement that the Spanish were the only country in Europe reporting the crisis back then, in times where Western Europe was mostly focused on the Great War. Here we find some of the first scientific drawings of a microscopic reality invisible to the human eye. With the invention of the camera, with the invention of photography, plus with the advances of natural science and biology, humanity was reduced to a defenseless force, opposed to the great ideals of humanism in the Renaissance and scientific progress in the early stages of modernity. What we see here is that the biggest enemies in human history are far away from a military troop, an entire country, a group of rebels, or a lavish king. And also with these diagrams, we come to realize the irony in being seriously affected to the point of extinction, if it were the case, by a material, extinction, extinction, if it were the case, by a material real entity that, however, appears imperceptible to our limited eyes. Nature, and this is a great lesson for today's current times, nature is way more powerful than humanity altogether. And going back to art, it is impressive to see how many of these visual appearances of microscopic creatures resemble the works and searches produced by abstractionists and avant-garde artists such as Vasily Kandinsky, Joan Miro, Yves Tanguy, or in this specific case, Paul Klee. And I wanted to bring this artist to the table because there was some kind of a happy accident while I was preparing the webinar. I was ready to incorporate Paul Klee's work only to discuss the formal and chromatic qualities of his work as they resemble in their abstraction biological or microscopic diagrams of a sort. Little did I know that Paul Klee himself was victim of a serious illness that began around 1935, a scleroderma, which manifested in fatigue, skin rashes, difficulty in swallowing, shortness of breath, exertion, and pain in the joints of his hands, among other symptoms. As you can expect, his productivity as an artist was significantly reduced. Tod, as you can see on the right, means death in German. Und means and Feuer, I don't know how to pronounce it, but I just say Feuer, means fire. So the title of the painting is Death on Fire. And we see a face, or what appears to be a facial feature that pre-announces Paul Klee's tragic destiny. He died of that condition. The mouth has the shape of a rotated T, letter T. The right eye kind of resembles an O, and the left eye and his nose are reminiscent of an inclined D. So he's playing with thought, with the signals or with the signs of the letters T-O-D to create the face of the subject. And the red also conveys ideas of burning, feverish states. And it is at this point when we see more clearly the presence of the artwork, not as a representation, but as an extension of the life experiences of the artist, not to mention the artwork on the left, titled Intoxication, which seems more like molecular or sort of like microscopic entities rather than human figures or elements that we will find in reality, in nature. I mean, of course, we find biological entities in nature, but not in the human sense of nature as we are used to seeing in artistic depictions. Quoting H.R. Patkin, speaking of the provenance of this work, I open quote, "I was struggling with the history of modernism, modernist space. I thought, I'm done with that. People are getting sick." This is in 1981. "These wounds are oozing from inside. It's not something I could say in words." He continued, "This is something I did in painting." So this artwork, Unveiling of a Modern Chastity, is based on the artist's own experiences while going to a walk-in clinic in New York City in 1981 to have a regular checkup. He was concerned that he was probably that he had probably contracted AIDS because he used to go out and hang out at night at these places in New York City, such as Studio 54. And back then, the music and the dancing scene in New York was quite heavy. So he was a bit concerned about that. And there, while in the waiting room, he faced a very challenging and life-changing situation. He saw at distance the skin lesions of two patients who were in the waiting room. The experience in the waiting room, he recalls, terrified me. It made a huge impression on me. there was no doubt in my mind that something wrong was going on. He went back to the studio and created this painting inspired by the earlier works of Yves Klein, using latex blended with liquid rubber and printing ink, resembling the visual and textural aspect of the sarcoma lesions in the skin. Back at his studio, Patkin began work on a painting that borrowed its size and style, even not its palette, from iconic sponge works by French artist Yves Klein. He used latex blended with liquid rubber and printed ink, as I mentioned, and along in the upper border of the piece, he subtly included the words unveiling of a modern chastity. What is that modern chastity? That type of mindset that began in the 80s, entirely devoted to a culture of asepsis, hygiene, and pristine cleanness of the body. And this is something that is also present. This concern is also present in Andres Serranos's Blood and Semen 5 from 1990. It's a mixture of blood, a photograph, a print of blood and semen seen as if under a microscope. So again, we go back to microscopic images of realities that are invisible to the naked eye. In the context of the AIDS crisis, Serranos's commentary can be interpreted in the paradoxical nature of blood and semen. As fluids can cure, can give us life, such as semen or blood, but an infected semen or infected blood can also kill us. So it's the paradox, once again, the fight, the struggle that we saw at the beginning with Buffalmacco and with Peter Bruegel, the elder, that opposed struggle between life and death. We're getting close to the end, time flies, but we still have a bunch of images to discuss, so stick with me. In a recent interview, Hong Kong artist Angela Su declared, I open quote, "In the performance Cosmic Call, I will be injected with different deadly viruses and I will eventually turn into a virus myself," end of quote. The project was supposed to be exhibited at the Museo Universitario de Arte Contemporáneo in Mexico City this year. I don't need to tell you what happened next. Now it's an online exhibition. And we can look at this project under two different yet parallel lenses. Sorry, I'm mixing my words here, I don't know why. We can look at this under two different lenses. One, we can say the obvious. This is prophetic. Angela Su foresaw this crisis. Or two, we can take the obvious but yet uncomfortable approach. And it is that it was very likely that a crisis like our current crisis with the COVID-19 situation was bound to happen. We knew this was going to happen, but we just ignored it. You know, we didn't want to believe this reality. There are some other global crises that are currently undergoing, but we underestimate them. And we will probably keep underestimating them until it's too late. Hopefully not. The action of Su incorporates elements of reality and science fiction and confronts audiences with the contrasting realities of a virus. The aseptic hospital versus the uncontrollable spreading of a disease, the white, pristine presence of the hospital and the nurses versus the darkness of death, the order and symmetrical organization of bioengineered science and spaces devoted to scientific research versus the chaotic uncertainty of humanity's destiny. This is yet one of the most compelling and prophetic projects that I have seen over the last few months. The last theory had a residence at the World Health Organization a couple years ago to explore the reality of how the Sars epidemic or pandemic, I don't know if the Sars was declared a pandemic, I can't recall, started. So it's not the virus itself that we see here, or in the case of Angela Su's project, but the indexical presence of a space where an event of traumatic nature happened or could eventually happen again. In the night of February 21st, 2003, 17 individuals from all parts of the world checked in to the 9th floor of the Metropole Hotel in Hong Kong. This is a recreation in scale of that floor. Little did they know that this was the start of the Sars outbreak crisis. According to the blast theory's description, I open quote, on February 21st, 2003, a 64-year-old doctor from Guangdong in China checked into room 911 of the Metropole Hotel in Hong Kong to attend a family wedding. The next morning, he woke up with a fever and admitted himself to the nearest hospital. Over the subsequent days, 16 of the guests who stayed on the 9th floor of that hotel that night boarded flights home, taking the virus with them to the Philippines, Singapore, Canada, Vietnam, Australia, and the US, among others. End of quote. As part of our residency, oh, I open another quote, sorry, they continue. As part of our residency, we made 3 trips in early 2018 to interview key staff at the Strategic Health Operations Center, which monitors epidemics and pandemics across the world and coordinates international collaboration in response. We explored how epidemiologists studied the movements of each of the guests in the Metropole Hotel that night, even conducting tests to trace airflow between rooms. So this model has served the World Health Organization. Even right now, in the current COVID-19 situation, it has served the World Health Organization to understand how certain viruses and diseases of that kind behave in certain spaces, particularly in closed spaces. So many of the measures that we have nowadays with social distancing and whatnot are based on the way the virus behaved in that hotel back in 2003 in Hong Kong. So in the project, visitors can make use of the audio handsets to listen to 2 accounts of the Sars outbreak. So it's an interactive artwork to raise awareness of an emergency of this nature. And moving on here, I feel that we are in the age of big data, and big data, numbers, statistics, maps are our only current tools to try to realize what is going on with this virus. So every day, every week, we look at the numbers, we look at the maps. We became familiar with the term curve, flattening the curve, number of cases. So the virus became rather an statistics as opposed to a human reality. So if the statistics come down, we feel good, we feel better. But we seem to forget the human aspect of it. And when looking at these ciphers, and it happens to me as well, we're mainly focused on big data, on quantifiable reality. So we are in the age of a digital pandemic. So we see here on the left, curves, graphics. On the right, we see maps, and maps in red. Once again, the red coming as the color of death, as the color of illness, as the color of emergency. So those same principles that we studied, that we saw before, are coming back again and again here. Nicolas Le Pen created a project, excuse me, speaking of copying, in 2020, titled Visualizing the History of Pandemics, an Ongoing Project. And I know I'm running out of time, but I will try to move as effectively as possible. Look at the figures to understand the different plagues and viruses across time. We see here, just to name a few, AIDS, yellow fever, the 17th century Great Plague, and the comparison between one and the other. A comparison that resembles the comparison amongst the sizes of planets in the universe. COVID-19 is right here, right now. So it's interesting to understand viruses in this way, because again, we're trying to provide with a face something who has no face, which has no face. And the same on the left, the basic reproduction number of diseases based on what the disease is. We're gonna move on here. Where am I? There we go. This is another diagram of that Nicolas Le Pen project, with the same diagram that we saw before, but a little bit bigger, a little more detailed. So it also gives you an idea of how bad the Black Death, the bubonic plague, and the smallpox was. By looking at this diagram, it seems that we're doing a bit better. And it's also a reminder of the four principles, the four humors in Hippocratic medicine. And you remember when I told you, when we were looking at Edward Hopper's painting in the background, I told you, remember this information about the colors, and look here, the colors. Blood is air, spring, and is related to the liver. Yellow bile is related to fire, summer, and gallbladder. Black bile is related to earth, autumn, spleen, and phlegm is related to water, winter, brain, and lungs. The challenges posed between prevailing powers and the dominated, in other words, the owner and the servant, have been historically solved by portraying and visualizing a non-existent enemy, in this particular case, the Asian community, to be held accountable and thus targeted as an emerging threat that must be eradicated as if they were a plague from the surface of Earth by any means necessary. Why do I say this? Those who live in Canada probably heard, particularly in BC, of the Asian hornet, the Asian mortar hornet. And this is a picture of the hornet, but this came on the news a few days later, and this happened back in May. So we are struggling with COVID-19, and this comes on the news. We're trying to visualize a threat, a menace, but look at the way the threat is visualized. The resemblances of the news media reports and descriptions of the so-called Asian hornet with racist depictions of Asian communities, in the racist gold rush depictions of Asian immigrants in the 19th century, the World War II era cartoons such as Tokyo Kids Say are uncanny. Demonesque creatures with tentacles for arms, fangs, drooling mouths, wispy facial hair, and squinty eyes, pointed, sharp daggers reminiscent of the hornet's stinger, are the perfect formula to perpetuate a racial bias that defines viruses, plagues, or diseases of any kind as a threat purposefully and supposedly created by the cultural other. It seems to many that this, let me try to organize my thought, that we have a need to disempower the gaze of those who tend to racialize and determine cultural and political power based on facial looks. And this connects a little bit with the debate of wearing or not wearing a mask. For Eurocentric societies, masked faces are synonyms of weakness, inferiority, and sickness. And we could bring this further to better understand that rhetoric behind the current controversy, whether should I wear a mask or not. And in fact, it has been said that the reluctance to wear masks in Western societies, in Europe and in North America, obeys to a culturally biased association of the act of covering your face with the denial of individual identity. A South Korean-born German philosopher, Byung-Chul Han, said in an article published last March, I open quote, "There is a cultural difference in European countries and among white populated cultures overall, because in Europe, there is an individualism that brings with it the habit of wearing an uncovered face. For the European mindset, the only people who are masked are the others, and the others are criminals," end of quote. Finally, I apologize that it took me a little bit longer than what I expected. Just to end on kind of a shiny, jolly note, what happened with superheroes? It seems that superheroes are defenseless when it comes to the reality of a virus. It's an invisible enemy. It's not Lex Luthor. It's not the Joker. It's not the Penguin or Catwoman. It's not Thanos even. We cannot fight. We cannot physically confront that enemy. And Superman actually gets a virus. And these are some depictions of Superman, 156 from October 1968, I believe, or 1980. No, I believe this is 1987, and Action Comics from May 1968. Superman is sick as a superhero, but here, Superman is sick with a virus as a human. He's not Superman. He's Clark Kent. He's sneezing, he's coughing. I'm just gonna play this while I talk. Let me see if I can, there you go. I know that the image won't be the best. I don't really mind about the sound, but just to show you the scenario, to show you the context of what is going on with Superman. Lois Lane is going to take care of him. She wants to know what is going on. She cannot open the door. Superman is not Superman. Superman has been devoid of his superpowers. He's sweating, he's sneezing, he's coughing, and Lois Lane is ashamed of looking at him like that, and she's concerned. He became human. And finally, before we go, this was a campaign that started in Mexico as part of the COVID-19 contingency plan. They created a superhero known as Susana Distancia. I don't know how to translate that. It's a play word in Spanish, but it's Susana is the name, Suzanne, but Susana Distancia could be translated as your healthy distance, okay? So it's a play word between the name and the idea that you should keep 2 meters away from each other to preserve social distancing. And I love it because the government's depiction and portrayal of the superhero is not that great, but people, aficionados, art aficionados and amateur artists appropriated the icon and created their own versions. So here, this guy, Tavo Duarte, created his own version of Susana Distancia, and I love it because it's a Mexican telenovela in itself. Apparently, the virus is Susana Distancia's father. So Susana Distancia is the daughter of a virus in a similar fashion as Superman. Many people argue that Superman was born in Krypton, and that sort of like greenish thing was part of a global threat that could kill humans, but Superman was immune to that. And I don't know, but I probably just speaking gibberish. But anyway, so speaking of preserving distance, I hope that you preserve distance. I hope that you enjoy the presentation. And again, I apologize for extending a little bit in my presentation. Thank you so much.
If anyone out there does have any questions, again, please enter them into either the Q&A or the chat feature. I just wanted to maybe start off just with one. Looking back at the artists from like ACT UP and even General Idea and sort of that era, I mean, I don't know a lot about those artists individually. I know them more as a collective. I found it interesting how at a time of crisis, you would get a group of artists that would come together to create work that might not necessarily be the type of work they would normally create. Like they're creating billboards, they're creating things for buses, like they're creating something that's far more public. Do you think that's something that might come about again, or do you see that kind of trend? Is that something that happens in times of a crisis?
I think it's already happening. I didn't have time the other day I think I mentioned briefly a project of an artistic exchange that is happening in Colombia currently. Unfortunately, I don't have images, but the idea is that well-established and emerging artists are using their own places, their own houses as display windows, as exhibition places. So I can think of a couple examples. One guy took his bed and placed his bed and all the objects that he's surrounded by in his bed during quarantine, he placed them in the balcony of the building. So neighbors could see what his reality was, and it was a way for him to kind of like feel compassionate, but also feel solidarity and show a little bit of support to those who feel lonely and whatnot. We found a bunch of examples in Italy at the beginning of the pandemic, when people will go out at 7 p.m. to clap and to applaud the health workers and the frontline workers. We saw plenty of examples of musicians singing and performing live. But those projects tend to be more disinterested in the critical sense of the word, if you ask me. I haven't really seen projects that are sort of questioning governments right now for their failed attempts in containing the virus. But I'm pretty sure it's bound to happen. If it is not already happening, and probably I don't know about it. But in addition, many crises sort of like converged at the same time. So it seems that there is a bubble about to burst, you know. The economic crisis that will come as a consequence of the COVID-19 and the crisis in the art community as well. And you probably know about this, many budgets that are being cut down, governments who don't want to support artistic projects, where in reality, this is the time where they should be supporting more artistic projects. I'm pretty sure that something like this is going to happen again. It's already happening with the Black Lives Matter movement. So why wouldn't it happen with the current health crisis? I'm pretty sure it will happen. And it will happen again in a collective sense, for sure. I don't think individualism or artistic egos are no longer and will no longer be accepted, at least in the general public. There might be a closed circuit of collectors and people who will still appreciate that, but the people are craving more of answers to a lot of questions that come out of this uncertainty.
But I think what struck me was just seeing the dates of all those, like Grand Fury and all. It's around the 80s. You know, you might have had some in the 60s as well. I'm sure there was a lot of other. Were there any times like before that, do you think, where artists were kind of working together? I mean, I'm just thinking of, you know, your examples of like Edward Munch, who was alone, you know, in his home and probably alone in his studio doing his thing. But were there other times in history where artists were maybe getting together?
Well, back in the early 20th century, what we know as art movements, back then they weren't known or they weren't called art collectives. But if we look at the art movements, I mean, Cubism was a collective. And in fact, inventions such as the papier-collé, the collages in Cubism were collective enterprises. And one of the main principles of Cubism was not to show an individual style. That's why in many of the early stages of Cubism, it's really hard to tell between the works of Picasso or the works of George Braque. Dada was a collective. Surrealism was a collective. Die Brücke, or my German is terrible, the bridge, the German expressionistic movement was a collective, and it was actually a guild. It was a society of artists. The Impressionists were a society of artists as well, but the name was coined by a critic. They appropriated the name, which was a negative critique. They took that as their own name, you know, but originally they were called something pretty boring, like something like Society of Anonymous Artists, Artisans, Sculptors, and blah, 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 of the Society of Paris, something like that. So there was that collective feeling. Now, that doesn't mean that the results and the products of that collective feeling were also collective. And I think that's the difference as you proclaim. And that's one of the many reasons why some of those projects didn't really have a lot of public outreach. I mean, the times were different in the sense of commissions, patronage, and collecting. So it was more of a kind of a competence, if you will.
Yeah, true. Yeah, interesting. We have one question from Yvonne. How about invisible illnesses, those that are denied or not taken seriously, mental illness or mental health issues? Have you?
It's interesting because that reminds me of, let's go back to, where is it? Paul Klee. Paul Klee was part of a 1937 show in Germany, I believe it was in Berlin, the Degenerate Art Show. And it's not that he was part of the show himself. His artworks were chosen amongst other artworks by Vasily Kandinsky, by the Dadaist artists, by the Surrealists, and they were organized by the Nazis to mock them. And by titling the show The Degenerate Art Show, they were implying that every artistic attempt in modernity was the result, or rather the consequence of a mental illness. So the correlation is interesting because in a certain way, I feel that Edward Munch, I can think of Edward Munch here. He was in a lot of mental distress for sure. And it's been reported that he had some mental issues. Now, the problem with taking that approach is that we fall into what I call the Van Gogh syndrome. And the Van Gogh syndrome is the belief that every artwork created by Vincent van Gogh was the result of his mental condition and the result that he was in a mental asylum. And I think that's a misconception. Van Gogh, at a certain period of his life, knew exactly why he was doing what he was doing and why he was choosing the type of color palette. And if you read the letters that he used to send to his brother Theo, he explains that, and you see that he's as rational as you can get. There is a lot of research, and which I am not very familiar with, but I know there is a whole field into art therapy, and particularly art therapy specialized in trauma studies as a way to explore intrinsic mental states of mind. And that's why I'm one of the advocates of the importance of using art as a therapy to cope with these conflicting times. Even if you're not an artist, just drag a pen and a sketchbook and doodle something, because that's important.
Mm-hmm. Another, I guess, more of a comment from Andre. Is it possible that some artists emerge due to COVID-19, as it happened in the 80s and 90s with the AIDS movement? They become relevant not only for their art, but because of the disease.
Absolutely. Well, that's a good point. I think I know, I understand the point of the question. They will emerge, but unfortunately, my fear is that they will be made into martyrs, not because of what the importance, the public importance and the public awareness that they can create with their work, but because of their condition, So instead of being known as the guy who created this and began this movement and propelled this social change, they will be known as, oh, the guy with COVID. And that's something that also happened with, I believe, with Keith Haring. It's interesting, however, that this doesn't happen with Edward Munch or with Gustav Klimt or with Egon Schiele. And in fact, I learned about their condition until very recently. I didn't know. I knew that they had died of a bad disease, but I didn't know that it had been the Spanish flu.
Right. All right. Well, we don't have any further questions from the audience tonight. So I think you gave us a lot to think about, a lot to unpack. I mean, there was so much from going way back in history, to the Renaissance to all the way to today. It was really interesting sort of stroll through history.
Yeah, it was quite intense.
So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Kathy. It was, this series was a pleasure. I really, I always say that I am facilitating an information and a knowledge, but I am also learning a lot through this research and also through the interaction and the participation of the attendees. So thank you also for those who are participating and who engaged in the conversation tonight.
Yes, I agree. Thank you very much for everyone who came. A lot of the comments are mostly just thank you. So that's great. I think you answered all their questions. So
wonderful.
Thank you again so much for coming. For those of you who want to come back to the salon, Next month, we have a panel discussion with 3 curators from 3 different places who will be talking about what the potentials might be for galleries, for artists, for exhibitions as we move through COVID and openings and closings of galleries and other art spaces. So join us next month. Someone just asked about the recording. This was recorded. It should be posted to both the Richmond Art Gallery website as well as the Richmond Art Gallery's YouTube channel, probably in a few weeks. It usually takes us a few weeks just to get it online. So come back and check then if you wanted to review anything. In the recording, I will include, I noticed in Jairo's images, he had some links. So I will include those links to the specific images or to the specific exhibition as well. So those will be all included on the YouTube channel for you all. So again, thank you everyone for stopping in tonight. Thank you again to Jairo and to Mobil Art School who recommended you. Thanks very much everyone, and hopefully we'll see you next month.
Thank you, Kathy. Good night. Good night, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.